The human being must open up to a new thinking about himself, herself, just as he or she must correct and no longer condemn himself, herself.
Henceforth, the human being must make sure, every time he or she believes that a fellow human being has offended him or her, to investigate in himself or herself whether that which is offending him or her comes from himself or herself and from his or her wrong thoughts and feelings, because it usually arises of his or her own accord. However, usually he or she does not want to hold himself or herself responsible for it, because he or she prefers to look for that which is fallible in others and not in himself or herself. Consequently, he or she criticizes another human being and believes that he or she is being offended and unrightful things are being done to him or her. If that person says something to him or her that corresponds to the truth, which he or she does not like to bear, however, because it affects and reveals to him or her that which wrongly takes place in his or her thoughts, feelings, and in his or her modes of behavior. So the rule is that which he or she interprets with fellow human beings as an offense to his or her person, actions, and modes of behavior, in truth, is nothing other than a wrong vindication of himself or herself, through which he or she wrongly tries to mask, or to represent in himself or herself, and to change his or her own inner offense, so that he or she achieves a positive effect for himself or herself, and his or her flaws do not become conscious, recognizable, and visible to him or her. However, in doing so, he or she blames others for the offense which he or she inflicts upon himself or herself. Thus he or she makes accountable those human beings who openly, honestly, and helpfully confront him or her with the truth. However, this leads to his or her fellow human beings rejecting him or her and treating him or her unlovingly. In fact, because they perceive his or her impulsations of the thoughts and feelings which he or she radiates and which spread out into the world, where through the swinging wave-based climate around him or her is damaged in a negative form. Thereby the human being seems repulsive to fellow human beings and becomes his or her own enemy, because he or she increasingly isolates himself or herself externally through his or her wrong, ungood, negative, and unhappy, and also unsatisfied thoughts and feelings, and falls into depression and also into grumpiness. So he or she must now face up to this truth and learn to grasp and understand all the connections in this regard. Thus he or she must turn to these causes of his or her Leiden and self-condemnation, and begin to dissolve all the evil, false, bad, and untrue thoughts and feelings he or she carries around. And if the human being does this, then he or she has in his or her hand the key to that realm into which he or she can enter, and which produces joy, peace, freedom, and happiness, as well as satisfaction and confidence in him or her. The whole issue, first and foremost, is about dissolving and revising his or her traditional loveless, offending and condemning thoughts and feelings, and also his or her actions and behavior in relation to himself or herself, and transforming them into better, good, positive, and valueful forms. He or she must open himself or herself up to a new thinking about himself herself, just as he or she must correct and no longer condemn himself or herself. It is now time that the human being no longer offends, rather forgives himself or herself for all that which he or she has done wrongly in his or her life. To do this, it is only necessary to observe and consider and realize everything which he or she has done well, positively, rightly, and as best as possible. Thereby he or she must be conscious that which he or she has done wrongly in his her life in the past could not be done otherwise, because he or she did not know any better. But now he or she lives in the present, and in the meantime has come to know very many new things through his or her learning, and he or she has become knowing enough to understand the effective and true connections of his or her unhappiness and unsatisfaction. So from now on, he or she will no longer harbor unconscious negative thoughts and feelings, and also no longer act unconsciously in a wrong form. Rather, henceforth, he or she will consciously control himself or herself, his or her world of thoughts and feelings, his or her actions, and his or her modes of behavior, and likewise consciously care for them. And she does this when he or she thinks, feels, and speaks, as well as when he or she does his or her work, when he or she continues to learn and turns into a happy and satisfied human being. And the human being does it because he or she knows that he or she knows what he or she does and must do. And because he or she now knows that she no longer has to offend, rather has to look after and accept himself or herself, and is not really at fault for having led and lived his or her life in a wrong form up to now, precisely because he or she did not know any better. Everything that has been today plays no role for him or her any longer. Therefore, not even that he or she was unsuccessful in his or her life and has lost hope in himself or herself and failed to the point of unhappiness and unsatisfaction. No fellow human being can empathize with him or her about this, nor that his or her consciousness, thoughts, feelings, and psyche, as well as his or her body, have become ill, because only he or she alone can know how his or her condition has been in this regard up to this point. But now he or she can pull himself or herself together, and, as a human being who is becoming healthy, be his or her own lord and master, and free himself or herself from all old evils. And no one can discourage him or her from doing so, if he or she willingly and volitionally leaves the way which he or she has unconsciously taken, and forgives himself or herself for that which she has lived wrongly. Because henceforth he or she is taking the new way, wherethrough the tide of his or her life turns towards that which is good, positive, and right. However, this act of his or her self-forgiveness and henceforth self-determination towards a new life-forming and life-conduct works via his or her healthy thoughts and feelings, which produce a healthy psyche for him or her. However, to do this, it is necessary that the human being opens up to a new thinking about himself or herself, as well as to correcting and no longer condemning himself or herself. Henceforth he or she must be prepared to build up his or her self-love in himself, herself, in order to give himself or herself all the love she needs, and accept, acknowledge, and appreciate himself or herself as a lovable human being. The human being must use his or her self-love in order to be happy and free and have peace in himself or herself, because it is his or her honest love for himself or herself which bestows gladness, freedom, and peace to him or her, never punishes him or her with negative and bad thoughts and feelings, never accuses, and also never condemns him, her. His or her own honest and righteous self-love is like a polished diamond, which shines in all its brilliance. Henceforth, if the human being uses his or her change to a new life, and observes and considers his or her old life up to now, and looks back at all that which he or she has done wrongly, then he or she recognizes that that which he or she has learnt has led him or her to exactly this point at which he or she now stands, and henceforth consciously has the opportunity to become a healthy, happy, and satisfied human being in terms of thoughts, feelings, psyche, and consciousness. And everything which she does henceforth starting today in a good, positive, and right form in regard to his or her thoughts, feelings, consciousness, and psyche, as well as his or her actions and modes of behavior, will never be in vain. Rather, will bring him or her only that which is better, good, positive, right, and valueful in his or her life onwards.
Simyase Silver Star Center, 15th March 2016, 2353, Billy.